Hello, and welcome to the Crime Victim Services Programmatic Post-Award Training. The goal of today's workshop is to provide your agency with the building blocks to successfully meet CVS grant post-award requirements. This presentation is an overview geared toward all CVS grantees, independent of funding source. This particular workshop is geared toward those individuals who oversee and provide the day-to-day administration of their CVS grant. Typically, this individual is the project director, but we realize there are many people involved in managing and ensuring your CVS grant is successful. In addition to this workshop that focuses on the programmatic aspects of your grant, project directors and financial officers should view the financial post-award training, as that will inform you specifically how to track and report expenses in your accounting system and how to submit required financial reports. To begin, please note that our office uses many acronyms. These are the most common acronyms used throughout this presentation. You will also see these in email communications or hear them during phone calls with your agency. Of course, this list is not exhaustive, but it does capture the main acronyms we use. The Office for Victims Programs, or OVP, is an office within the Division of Criminal Justice. OVP houses a variety of programs that support crime victims, such as the Crime Victim Services Funds, which are a variety of federal and state grants that I will go into detail about shortly. Victim compensation, which provides compensation for financial losses to families and victims of crime who have been physically or emotionally hurt as a result of a crime. Local VAWA, which provides grant funding to agencies that provide services to crime victims within local judicial districts, based on money collected from people convicted of certain crimes. The SAVE program, which ensures that medical and anonymous reporting victims of sexual assault are provided payment assistance for medical costs associated with obtaining medical forensic exams. The Colorado Human Trafficking Council, and the Colorado Mass Violence Toolkit for Crime Victim Advocates. OVP administers federal and state grants, which we call our CVS funding. These grants are awarded to the Colorado Department of Public Safety, Division of Criminal Justice, and are administered and distributed through the Office for Victims Programs. As the state administering agency, our office is given the discretion to interpret and determine further funding priorities and allowability of certain activities for each grant award. In addition, OVP administers the state bail funds, but these funds are not part of the CVS process and run on a different funding timeline. This grid outlines each grant, the specific intent, and if there is a match requirement. Briefly, our office administers VOCA, Victim Assistance Funds, which provide funding for direct services for victims of crime, VAWA, which assists projects that seek to develop and strengthen effective responses to sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking, SASP, dedicated to the provision of direct intervention and related assistance for victims of sexual assault, and general funds from the state that provide funding for services that support victims of crime. All grant programs are unique in their purpose for funding and grant requirements. At this point, programs should know their source of funding, but if not, please review your grant agreement, which will list your funding source. You can also call your grant program manager. As you can see in the notes, if you are a new program receiving VOCA funds for the first time, you would normally be required to provide 25% match instead of the usual 20%. As you can also see, all required match has been waived for VOCA for the current grant period. SASP and general funds do not require match. VAWA does require a 25% match, but certain programs are not required to provide match, such as tribes and community-based victim services projects. So now that your grant has started, or you've just taken over administrative responsibility for the grant, what should you expect? First, you'll be working with a grant program manager, or a GPM, and a grant financial manager, or GFM, while you administer your grant. If you do not know who your grant program manager is, please look in Flux or contact OVP. You will also be contacted by other staff at OVP regarding monitoring, compliance documents such as insurance or certifications, but you will most often communicate with your GPM and GFM throughout the grant period. Grant program managers have already contacted you and will be your main point of contact for all grant-related questions. Grant financial managers will contact you regarding any questions or concerns with your payment requests or financial reports. OVP sends out a monthly newsletter with important announcements and information related to CVS funding. This is our primary method for sharing important information, and all project officials should be reading this each month. All of your project officials have already been added to the newsletter distribution list, but you are responsible for adding other agency staff if needed. Some information will only be in the newsletter, so reading it is critical, as you will likely be unable to successfully administer your grant award without it. Projects should expect a monitoring visit from our office during the current grant period. It's required by some grant programs that we visit projects every 2 years, so look for an email from our monitors setting that up with you. This is not an audit by our office, but rather a compliance review. If you are new to CVS funding, you can reach out to your GPM for a list of documents your program will be asked to provide when monitoring if you wish to begin preparing. At some point in the grant cycle, you may be asked to submit financial supporting documentation for your payment request. It is expected that projects keep all financial supporting documentation in a hard or electronic grant file. Not every project will be asked to submit financial supporting documentation outside of a monitoring visit, but some will. More information about what our office expects in terms of supporting documentation is outlined in the Financial Post-Award webinar and other resources, which I will go over shortly. Finally, projects can expect more training and resources provided by our office over the grant period. Additional training and resources will be provided as needed and as specific training needs arise. Like I mentioned earlier, we want to ensure you have the building blocks to successfully manage your grant and the day-to-day work you have to do. Now that you know generally what to expect from our office, what does OVP expect of your program? It's expected that you submit your monthly, quarterly, and/or annual reports on time. If for whatever reason you need to submit a report late, please contact your grant program manager immediately to get an extension. We understand things happen, but if it is not communicated with us, it can have consequences, such as delaying payment to your program. Projects are expected to maintain a hard or electronic grant file for their project with all applicable information and documents contained in one place. More details will be provided later in the webinar. Please maintain regular communication with your grant program manager regarding staff turnover, project official changes, budget changes, and other important information. Projects should review their grant agreement budget to see specifically what has been approved. If you have a cost that occurs during the grant cycle that is not specifically in your budget, reach out to your grant program manager prior to incurring the cost, as it may not be allowable under your particular funding source. This is very important because if a cost is determined to be unallowable, you cannot be reimbursed for the cost through our grant. Projects should be providing services as outlined in their grant agreement. Any changes to any services funded by CVS grants funds should be reported to your grant program manager. Often, this will require a change form such as a budget revision or a grant amendment. Overall, you need to be familiar with your approved budget line items, and the services to be provided through your funded project. While your grant program manager is available to answer any questions you may have, there are also online resources you can access to answer questions you may have about managing your grant, filling out and submitting reports, and other requirements related to your CVS grant. In these next few slides, we will be highlighting some resources available to you to help you successfully manage your award. On these next two slides, you will see a list of resources and what information you can find in them. The first is your grant agreement, which can be found in Flux. The OVP website also has several linked resources. The Essential Grant Accounting and Financial Documentation Packet can be found online. DCJ Grants and Resources websites has reporting form guidance and the administrative guides. And then the DOJ Grants Financial Guide can also be found on the link on this slide. As mentioned in the previous slides, your grant agreement is a resource for you and includes the terms and requirements of your grant agreement. There are many terms and conditions that apply to your award. However, there are three we want to highlight. These terms and requirements are specific to federal grantees, so if you receive general funds, these requirements do not apply to your grant. The first has to do with determining the suitability of staff before allowing them to interact with minors participating in your program. The special condition references specific databases that must be checked to meet this requirement. Please review this special condition and the DCJ guidance that has been created for this special condition. Another one we want to point out is the requirement to verify employment eligibility of grant-funded staff. There is no one system for verifying employment, but many grantees use E-Verify. You must also maintain records of all employment eligibility verifications in accordance with the Form I-9 requirements. Our monitors will review the I-9 forms for grant-funded staff during your monitoring review. Lastly, VAWA and SASP grantees are required to have a policy for response to workplace-related incidents of sexual misconduct, domestic violence, and dating violence. Again, there are many special conditions and requirements related to your award, so you should review your grant agreement and the accompanying special conditions in detail. Now that we've gone over resources to help you successfully manage your grant, we're going to talk a little bit more about your grant file and what should be included in it at all times. First of all, you need to ensure that you keep your file for at least 3 years after the project has officially been closed. This is because the files can still be pulled for auditing or site visits by our funders, so it's important that your grant file be on file and be handy and readily available. Keep in mind that it takes our office up to 6 months to officially close out your grant after the grant period ends, so in reality, it is best to maintain your grant project file for 3.5 years. There are a few components to a complete grant file, and how that looks may vary slightly between each agency. One important thing to remember is that you should have one grant file per award. For example, if you have a VAWA grant and a VOCA grant, you should have 2 separate grant files, one for VAWA and one for VOCA. Keep your documentation separate for each grant award. Grantees can maintain hard copies or electronic versions of their grant materials. This and the next slide cover the materials that should be in your grant file, including your grant agreement, reporting documentation, including supporting documentation for both financial and programmatic reports, financial documentation to support expenses incurred and charged to the grant, programmatic documentation, as I said before, communication with your DCJ grant manager, your GPM and GFM, and additional information pertinent to the special conditions of your grant award. Each grant award is required to include the name and contact information of their project officials, which include the project director, financial officer, and signature authority, but may also include a separate primary contact as applicable. Any changes in the project officials must be communicated to your grant program manager via the DCJ Form 4B submitted in Flux for approval by your GPM. This slide outlines the major responsibilities of each project official. In addition, it's important that there's a separation of duty between all these positions. The same person cannot serve as both the signature authority and the project director or any combination of project officials. Not all projects will have approved budget amounts in each budget category listed in these next slides, but each grantee should regularly compare actual expenditures with approved budget amounts in each budget category. As mentioned previously, you should always keep a copy of your most recent approved budget in your grant file. Budget modifications are submitted via the DCJ Form 4A in Flux and must be approved by your grant program manager before you incur a cost. I will briefly review each budget category, but for a more in-depth review of budget categories and the supporting documentation required for each type of expense, please review the Financial Post-Award webinar. The first major category is personnel, which is comprised of salaries and or fringe benefits, supplies and operating for project-related program supplies, travel, equipment, which is items costing $10,000 or more per unit with a useful life of more than 1 year, contracts and consultants, which are professional services provided for the grant project and require additional forms, and last but not least, indirect costs incurred that are necessary to the provision of direct services, but cannot be tied to or readily allocated to a specific grant project or activity. There are two types of indirect calculations. The first is the 15% de minimis, and the second is a federally negotiated rate. Examples of costs frequently treated as indirect costs are facility or building maintenance, general supplies, and depreciation. Now we're going to start looking at regularly required reports and payment requests. This slide covers grantees who are reimbursed on a quarterly basis. For a more detailed list for grantees receiving monthly reimbursements, please ask your grant program manager for the monthly payments reporting schedule. As you can see, reports are first due quarter 1, covering the period of January through March, on April 15th. This would include your financial report, your narrative report, your payment request, and if you are a VOCA grantee, your online PMT, and then general fund grantees, your data report. These same reports are then due for quarters 2, 3, and 4. Please note that financial reports are due early during the second quarter due to the state's fiscal year end closing process. It's important to remember these different due dates. Specific information about the data reports for VOCA PMT and general fund grants is available in our TA resources folder, and information about the SASP and STOP VAWA annual reports will be provided by the specific administrator for these programs in our office. Now that I've gone over the basic elements of your grant and what's expected programmatically, I want to take a few minutes to highlight some important information and requirements that are laid out in your grant agreement. Federal awards and our administrative guides that are commonly overlooked by our programs during the grant period. First, our staff changes to your grant. This is different than the project officials I noted above. These are staff listed in your approved budget, being reimbursed by the grant or being used as match. If you've read your grant agreement, you may have noticed that you must immediately notify OVP of any project or match staff changes or of any grant-funded or matched position that is vacant for more than 45 days. This means if there is a job title change, salary change, change in the amount charged to the grant, or if the staff person left and someone else took over, you must let us know about the change. The second thing that is often missed by our programs is that all published or printed materials paid for by any of the federal grant funds must include an acknowledgement to the funding. If we're paying for brochures, presentation videos, or anything that will be distributed, you must acknowledge your grant funding. There is very specific language that needs to be included in this acknowledgement, and it can be found in your grant agreement. So it's extremely important to read it thoroughly. Something else that we may have already mentioned is that grantees will be monitored by our office at least every 2 years. This is not an audit, this is a compliance review. You are also required to submit an audit or financial review along with the applicable management letter annually to Division of Criminal Justice if your agency has completed one. Finally, as a recipient of our grant funding, you must maintain a current SAM registration, which stands for System for Award Management Registration, maintain required insurance coverages as outlined in our grant agreement. You will be contacted by our office for updated insurance information when needed, and maintain the EEOP certification and civil rights training certifications, which will be reviewed by our office during your monitoring visit. Some of these requirements may not apply to all grantees, so if you have concerns or questions, as always, please reach out to your grant program manager. This concludes the Programmatic Requirements webinar. These slides are also available on our website to download and refer to later. If you have questions, please contact your grant program manager directly. You can also reach us at our email address of cvsgrants@state.co.us or our main phone number 303-239-5719 with any other questions. Thank you for all the work you do for crime victims in Colorado. We are looking forward to working with you over the grant period.